Why would the UFC fire such a great fighter? Here are some facts. Jake Shields went on a 15-fight winning streak, defeated multiple future UFC champions, and held belts from multiple major organizations. And what did the UFC do? They fired him when he was still ranked in the top 15. That's right. They fired one of the best fighters in the division while he was still going strong. So what happened? Was it his snarling, choking grappling style? Was it the UFC's shift to a more entertainment-first business model? Or did Shields commit the ultimate sin in MMA? He won and lost, but he didn't win fans. Today, we'll break down the entire story, from his dominance outside the UFC, to his title rivalry with Georges St-Pierre, to his mysterious downfall. We'll delve into the real reason the UFC decided they didn't need Jake Shields. Because they might have made a big mistake. Shields grew up in the country, loved the outdoors, loved working out, and was always up for a challenge. And that's what led him to wrestling. When he discovered grappling, he was hooked. He wrestled throughout high school and college, but he wasn't just any ordinary wrestler. He was a brutal competitor, earned multiple All-American honors, and developed a high-pressure, control-based style that would later define his entire MMA career. But wrestling alone wasn't enough. After college, Shields not only wanted to stop competing, he wanted to fight. After his first fight, he met the perfect coach for his personality, the legendary Cesar Gracie. If that name sounds familiar now, it's because Cesar Gracie's gym has produced some of the toughest, most pragmatic fighters in the sport. We're talking about Nick Diaz and Nate Diaz. Yes, they're Shields' teammates. From day one, Shields trained with complete lunatics. While most MMA gyms focus on technique and structure, Cesar Gracie's camp was all about grit, toughness, and a warrior mentality. They weren't there to mess around, they were there to break you down. And that suited Jake Shields perfectly. He wasn't the flashiest. He wasn't the fastest. But he was one of the strongest guys on the mat. He took his wrestling roots, mixed them with jiu-jitsu, and developed a style that was pure pressure. When he put you on the ground, you couldn't get back up. But how this dominant style later became his greatest strength and his ultimate downfall in the UFC is a story that will change the way you look at the fight business forever. When Shields began his MMA career, it didn't take long for people to realize it. This guy was a nightmare matchup for almost everyone. Most were grapplers or strikers, but Shields had elite wrestling, breathtaking top control, and a clever submission technique. He made great strikers look dazed on the ground. He made great grapplers feel like they were drowning. No one had an answer for him. From 2005 to 2010, he went on a 15-fight winning streak, defeating future UFC champions and top contenders. He beat Carlos Condé, one of the most dangerous men in the sport. He submitted future UFC welterweight champion Robbie Lawler. He took down the legendary Dan Henderson, who had nuclear power. And then the UFC finally came calling. Shields was a world champion, a proven winner, and had the skills to be a problem in the UFC welterweight division. Everything was lining up perfectly. At least that's what we thought. Because once Shields got into the UFC, things didn't go according to plan. And at first, it seemed like the UFC was going all in on him. I mean, why wouldn't they? The guy was on a 15-fight winning streak, had multiple world titles, and had just knocked out Dan Henderson. Now, if that's not UFC championship material, I don't know what is. So when the UFC signed him, they immediately put him in a high-profile fight with Martin Kampmann at UFC 121. But from the moment the fight started, something felt off. Martin Kampmann wasn't a slacker. He was a legitimate striker with great wrestling skills, and he mixed it up really well. But realistically, Shields was the favorite. The UFC expected him to make a statement, prove that he belonged, and get ready for a huge fight with Georges St-Pierre. At least that's what it was supposed to be. Instead, we got a very strange, very shaky performance from Shields. You could tell right away that something wasn't quite right. His wrestling didn't look sharp. His heart was missing. He got hit harder in the exchanges. At one point, he even got guillotined, which wasn't a good look for someone known for his grappling. And the worst part? Shields' brutal weight cut nearly derailed his UFC debut, which was one of the biggest moments of his career. Now, to be fair, there was a reason for this. Before signing with the UFC, Shields fought at middleweight, 185 pounds. But when he dropped back down to welterweight, 170 pounds, he was just plain exhausted. After the fight, he admitted that he lost 20 pounds in just one day to make weight. That's crazy. So Shields won by split decision, but it didn't really feel like a win. It was a red flag. And UFC fans weren't fooled. Instead of thinking, oh, this guy's going to be a problem for GSP, many thought, wait a minute, this guy's the guy they're hyping up. But no matter how he looks, a win is a win, and Shields did enough to earn a title shot against Georges Pierre. So let's get started. The moment Jake Shields has been waiting for, a chance to fight for UFC gold. Now, let's set the stage. On April 30, 2011, UFC 129 in Toronto, Canada, drew 55,000 fans, the largest crowd in UFC history at the time. And the main event was Jake Shields taking on Georges Pierre for the UFC welterweight championship. It was huge. Shields had worked his whole life for this opportunity. He had beaten future champions, taken out the best contenders, and now he was just one fight away from becoming the best welterweight on the planet. But there was one small problem. He was fighting GSP. And GSP in 2011 was the best GSP ever. The guy was better than the wrestlers, better than the strikers, and better at planning than literally everyone in the division. So could Shields really pull it off? Well, not exactly. Here's the thing. On paper, Shields had a realistic path to victory. If he could get GSP to the ground, he had elite grappling to control him. If he could wear him down for 5 rounds, he could potentially pull off an upset. But the problem is, GSP isn't just any fighter. GSP is one of the smartest and most prepared fighters in MMA history. And from the moment the fight started, it was clear that GSP had a perfect game plan. He kept the fight on his feet, used his jab like a weapon, and kept Shields from getting close and trying to get a takedown. Basically, GSP turned the fight into a kickboxing match. And that was the worst-case scenario for Shields. The reality was undeniable. Shields' striking simply didn't live up to expectations. Not at all. His punches were awkward, his movements were stiff, and his striking looked like he was fighting underwater. So for 5 rounds, GSP just kept him out. But here's the craziest part. Even though Shields was losing, he still had his moments. In fact, he actually did something that no one had done to GSP in years. He broke him. In one of the most memorable moments of GSP's entire championship, Shields threw a jab that severely damaged St. Pierre's eye, leaving the champ half-blind for several rounds. This was something no other challenger had ever done to the seemingly untouchable GSP. Now, did that change the fight? It didn't. GSP still won by unanimous decision, and Shields never threatened to finish him. But the fact that Shields gave GSP a competitive fight was impressive in itself. But unfortunately, no one cared. The fight itself was boring. And that was the problem for the UFC. Remember, this wasn't just any random fight night. This was UFC 129, a huge arena show with 55,000 fans. The UFC wanted a memorable, explosive fight. Instead, they got a 5-round decision that no one was talking about. So Shields was up against one of the greatest fighters of all time, but the UFC's response was basically cool, but could they bring in someone more interesting? And so Shields' stock went down. Not because he lost, a lot of people lost to GSP. But not because he lost in an interesting way. And that's when the real trouble started. But what happened next exposed the uncomfortable truth about what the UFC really values in its fighters. Instead of coming out of that fight as a star, he came out as kind of a stray thought. And that was the beginning of a big problem. That's what ultimately got him kicked out of the UFC, even though he was still one of the best fighters in the world. Jake Shields won the fight. But he won it the wrong way. As you can see, if you are an MMA purist, you will love things like high-level grappling exchanges, elite positional control, and seeing fighters who completely nullify their opponent's game. And if you are one of those, you will probably enjoy watching guys like Khabib, Islam Makhachev, etc., Damian Maia, or even the best GSP. But the average UFC fan, well, they're wired differently. They don't care about positional dominance or subtle technique. They want big knockouts, crazy scrambles, and intense back-and-forth fights. They don't want to see someone knock someone down and control them for 15 minutes, even if it's a technical masterclass. And Jake Shields was one of the best grapplers in MMA. But he wasn't excited about it. His fights didn't have the brutal ground and pound of Khabib, they didn't have the clever submissions of someone like Charles Oliveira, and they definitely didn't have the explosive moments that make fights go viral. Shields' game was all about slowly wearing down his opponents, smothering them with control, and taking the power out of the fight. And to the hardcore fans, that's really impressive. But to Dana White and the UFC, that was a problem. The UFC didn't just want the best fighter, they wanted the most exciting fighter. That's why Shields was still in title contention after the GSP fight. All he had to do was beat Jake Ellenberger in his next fight. And honestly, if Shields could get Ellenberger on the ground, he probably would have knocked him out. But there was one big problem. Shields wasn't there mentally. Just weeks before the fight, Shields' father and longtime manager, Jack Shields, passed away. Nowadays, for most fighters, a coach is just a coach. But to Shields, his father was everything. He wasn't just someone who helped negotiate his contract. He was someone who was there from day one. He led him to tournaments, got him through tough training camps, and believed in him when no one else did. Losing him was like losing a part of yourself. For most people, that would be an immediate reason to back out of the fight. But Shields still showed up. He still walked into the octagon. And you could see it. The minute he stepped in there, he wasn't the same. His face, his body language, his movements just looked weird. And in the fight, Jake Ellenberger only had 53 seconds to knock him out. One moment, Shields was fighting to keep his title hopes alive. The next, he was lying on the canvas, staring into the light as everything fell apart. And just like that, in less than a minute, the dream was gone. This was a turning point, because for the first time in his UFC career, people weren't complaining that Shields was boring. They were talking about whether he belonged in the UFC. The pressure was getting worse with each fight. And to his credit, Shields recovered. In his next few fights, he won a decision over Yoshihiro Akiyama. It was okay, but it wasn't crazy. He wrestled Ed Herman hard, and actually won, but later got a draw after failing a drug test for taking diuretics. He also had a very close fight with Tyron Woodley, which he also won by decision. Now let's pause for a moment, because the Tyron Woodley fight is important. Woodley wasn't the guy who would become UFC champion at the time. But even then, he was a dangerous, explosive fighter, the kind of guy the UFC loves. And what did Shields do? He neutralized him. He took down one of the most dangerous men in the division. He didn't destroy him, he didn't finish him, but he still beat him. And you'd think the UFC would respect that, right? Well, no. Dana White responded by gushing about how bad the fight was, and the fans were not impressed. At this point, Shields was still winning the fight, and that should have kept him safe, right? Wrong. Because now the UFC wasn't just looking at whether the guy was winning. They were asking if this guy was helping sell tickets. And when Shields was booked against Damian Maia, it was basically like the UFC was saying, okay, let's see if this guy can actually be exciting. Now, if you like high-level grappling, this fight was incredible. It was one of the best pure jiu-jitsu fights in UFC history. Shields and Maia scrambled, changed positions, and showed some of the most technical grappling we've ever seen in the octagon for 5 rounds. But it wasn't exciting enough for the average fan. Shields won by split decision, but rather than celebrating a hard-fought victory, he found himself in an awkward position. Despite beating a world-class grappler like Maia, his style still presented a problem for the UFC. His next fight, on March 15, 2014, was against Hector Lombard, a dangerous heavyweight with the kind of knockout power that the UFC loves. And this time, Shields didn't win. Lombard crushed him, and just 3 weeks later, on April 6, Shields was cut by the UFC. And the thing is, he was still ranked 11th when he was released. In other words, the UFC fired the 15th ranked welterweight. Not because he wasn't good enough, but because they didn't like his style. On the surface, the UFC claimed it was just a business decision. But in reality, the reason Shields was cut was because he wasn't a knockout artist. He was cut because his fights didn't go viral. He was cut because he won the wrong way. And this was a wake-up call for the entire sport. If a guy like Jake Shields, who beat champions, won world titles, and defeated top contenders, could be cut simply because he wasn't entertaining enough? What does that mean for other grapplers? What does it mean for guys who have made careers in elite wrestling and jiu-jitsu? And perhaps the biggest question of all is, did the UFC stop looking for the best fighters and start focusing on other things? Since then, the UFC has focused more and more on interesting fighters, even if they aren't actually the best. And as time went on, Shields' release started to seem less like a business decision and more like the UFC making a statement. We don't just care about winning, we care about how you win. Jake was cut from the UFC. He must have been upset. Think about it. He was still in the top 15. He had just beaten Tyron Woodley and Damian Maia, both of whom later fought for UFC gold. And he was still one of the best grapplers in the entire division. But none of that mattered. In Dana White's eyes, Shields was bad for business. So where do you go when you're still elite, but the UFC no longer wants you? Well, in Jake Shields' case, the answer was the World Series of Fighting. And that's where things started to get weird. Shields kept winning, kept proving that he was still one of the best in the world, but now no one was paying attention. The situation made one thing very clear. The problem wasn't that Jake Shields wasn't good enough, it was that he was too good in a way that the UFC didn't want him to be. When Jake Shields signed with the World Series of Fighting in 2014, the promotion was basically trying to be the next big thing in the UFC, but honestly, no one saw it that way. But it was still a solid landing spot. And in his debut, Shields did what he always does. He knocked out Ryan Ford in the first round, putting him in a rear naked choke. When Shields started fighting outside of the UFC, he was actually finishing people off again. Because in the UFC, he fought killers all the time. But in the WSOF, with the talent gap being so big, Shields looked like a monster again. And that set him up for the fight with John Fitch. Another former UFC fighter, another grinder, another guy who got cut because he thought the UFC was boring. And if you were expecting a fast-paced war, yes, that didn't happen. Shields had the upper hand early on, but Fitch weathered the storm and won by decision. And just like that, Shields lost his first non-UFC fight in nearly a decade. But the crazy thing is, he wasn't done yet. Shields bounced back after that and went on another winning streak. He knocked out another solid veteran, Brian Foster, and then Danny Davis Jr. in another dominant performance. He was still proving that he was one of the best. But the problem was that it didn't matter anymore. At this point, Shields was fighting in obscurity. He went from fighting on huge UFC pay-per-views to fighting in half-empty arenas where almost no one was watching. And for someone who had spent his entire life striving for recognition, that must have been frustrating as hell. Shields wasn't just a worthless fighter at this point. He was still incredibly good. And yet, no matter how many times he won, he just seemed stuck. He was pushed off the biggest stages not because he had no talent, but because the UFC decided his style wasn't marketable. Now, you might be wondering why the UFC didn't bring him back. Well, by this point, the UFC had completely changed the way they did business. Just like when Shields first signed, they were still focused on bringing in the best talent from around the world. But after he was released, the UFC became much more selective about who they pushed. They wanted a fighter with a strong personality. They wanted someone who could sell pay-per-views. They wanted a knockout artist, not a grinder. Basically, what we call the McGregor effect these days. And Shields was never going to be that guy. Plus, by this time the UFC had enough big names in the welterweight division that they didn't need him anymore. They had Robbie Lawler, Johnny Hendricks, Tyron Woodley, Colby Covington. Shields was the exact opposite of what the UFC was looking for. So he kept winning, but the UFC never called him back. By 2018, Shields had one last chance. At this point, the WSOF had changed its name to the Professional Fighters League, PFL. And Shields saw it as his last chance to prove that he was still elite. And he started strong, crushing Herman Torredu in his PFL debut. But things started to slow down after that. In his next fight, he lost to Ray Cooper III. He was a dangerous young fighter who was too explosive and too strong for this stage of his career. Shields fought him again in the playoffs, but lost again. And just like that, his time as a top-tier fighter was over. There was no farewell match, no big goodbye, no last moment in the spotlight. Jake Shields was gone from the sport. And the craziest part is, even though he was still good enough to compete, the industry moved on without him. He was still one of the most successful welterweights of his era, but he ended up as a forgotten name. And that makes Jake Shields' career one of the biggest contradictions in MMA history. Because this guy should have been celebrated for his accomplishments. Instead, he was pushed aside because he didn't fight the way the UFC wanted him to. And that leads us to the next big question: was it a mistake for the UFC to cut him? Or was Shields just a guy from the wrong era? He was dismissed because he was too technical, too methodical, too boring. But here's the crazy part: the moment Shields left, something incredible started happening in the UFC. The guys that stayed? Yeah, they started fighting just like him. And instead of getting cut out for it, they started winning championships. Think about it. When Shields was in the UFC, he was constantly criticized for his grappling-centric, control-based style. He didn't do enough damage, he just kept his opponents down, and it wasn't exciting. But who was the most dominant fighter in the welterweight division right after he left? They had a very similar style. Let's start with Kamaru Usman. He's a tenacious wrestler who suffocates his opponents with control, pressure, and positional dominance. Usman dominated the welterweight division for years, defending his title 5 times, and knocking out strikers left and right in the same way Shields did. And here's the kicker. When Usman fought Tyron Woodley for the belt, it looked like Shields versus Woodley. Woodley was knocked down, choked, and completely subdued. And the people who used to call Shields boring were now calling Usman the dominant champion. It seems like the UFC has decided that this style is only problematic when Shields uses it. Now here's the question no one's asked. Would Shields actually have won the UFC title if he hadn't been cut? Because he lost to GSP. Sure, but who wouldn't? And let's not forget that Shields fought GSP half-blind for 5 rounds and still inflicted more damage than most of GSP's other challengers. So let's assume he stays. If he were to face someone like Tyron Woodley, we've already seen how that fight went. Shields won. And against someone like Robbie Lawler, well, we saw what happened when Shields fought Dan Henderson, who was even stronger than Lawler. Shields got knocked down, of course, but after recovering, he completely dominated Hendo for 4 rounds. So if he had fought Lawler, Shields would most likely win. And if that happens, if Shields takes the belt after GSP leaves, we're talking about him as a UFC champion, not an afterthought. But he had a long road ahead of him, and the UFC moved on without him. The most amazing thing about Shields' career is not that he got cut, but that the UFC pushed him right after. Suddenly being a dominant grappler was no longer a bad thing. It became a championship formula. They pushed Khabib Nurmagomedov, the ruthless pressure-based grappler, Islam Makhachev, the positional control machine, and Colby Covington, who stole Shields' style and mixed it with trash talk, and became a UFC headliner. And the best part is that when those guys fought, the UFC promoted them as elite technicians. But when Shields fought the same way, they called him boring and let him go. And that's what makes his story so frustrating. Because if he had come along a few years later, he might have been celebrated instead of ignored. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Okay, but does Shields actually deserve to be in the conversation of the greatest welterweights of all time? And honestly, yes. Let's look at the facts. Jake Shields has won 15 straight fights against some of the most powerful fighters in the sport. He's held titles in Strikeforce, Elite XC, and Rumble on the Rock, defeated Dan Henderson, Carlos Condit, Tyron Woodley, Damian Maia, Robbie Lawler, and countless other killers, and dominated every organization he's been a part of. And beyond the record, Shields has proven that technical superiority can work at the highest level. He just happened to show up when the UFC wasn't ready for it. If there's one lesson to be learned from the Jake Shields story, it's this: MMA isn't about who the best fighter is. It's about who the UFC wants to promote. And if you don't fit that mold, it doesn't matter how many people you've beaten. The UFC will move on without you. So was cutting Jake Shields the UFC's biggest mistake? When you look at his resume, the championships he's won, the titles he's won, and the legacy he's left behind, it's hard to argue otherwise. The UFC cut such a great fighter, and the decision still makes no sense years later. But true fans, we remember. So Jake Shields will always have a place in MMA history, whether the UFC likes it or not.